To tell you the truth, this place gives me the creeps. It's not a good thing they've started all this mess, man. I'm telling you, it's not a good thing. Ian looked at Vaslov in surprise. The old pilot had never been known for the tendency for superstition. Most spacemen had fallen into one of the extremes over time. Either they'd grown many superstitions, like the ancient sailors, or, on the contrary, they'd become ironclad rationalists with a tendency towards stoic fatalism. Until now, Jan had assumed that Vaslov had gone the second way, but now it looked otherwise. However, the Aleph object made the most unexpected impression on many people. On the one hand, its purpose as a library or data storage was considered more or less reliably established. On the other hand, even humans, or any other races of the galactic community, being technically inferior to the precursors, would not need to build an artificial planetoid even for the sake of stuffing into it. In addition to scientific data, all the literature and other works of art accumulated over several thousand years. In digitized form, of course. A block of crystal memory, the size of a dozen cubic meters, would be enough. Deciphering the data from the precursor's database would be an outstanding achievement. Unfortunately, the scientists could not even figure out how to retrieve the data from the drives. Sometimes, Ian wondered why they were so sure they were memory drives, not air fresheners or automatic toasters. So far, the scientists haven't even been able to turn them on. "What are you being paranoid about?" Ian said, looking at the Aleph object slowly zooming in on the view screen. The gray spheroid, with a surface that looked like it was made of shreds of metal, was like a giant tennis ball for Frankenstein's space monster. Scientists have been poking around almost since the discovery, and the strangest thing they've had happen so far is a 5-pack of beer going missing. Anyway, we're just cabbies, so if any of the eggheads end up bored out of their minds, it's our job to just wrap them up in a sheet and bring them back. Vaslov shook his head. His hair, though already half gray, as if in contrast to Ian's remark about the eggheads, showed no hint of thinning. "That's the problem," he said. "Nobody knows what this thing is or what it does. What if it's slowly influencing all the people here somehow? You know, there's a 2-year waiting list to come to this place, and that scares me." It was true. For several years of its existence, the scientific station on Aleph had become a place of pilgrimage for all the world's scientists. Even those whose specialty did not seem to be directly related to the study of artifacts of the precursors, such as biologists or linguists, were eager to come here. Among the scientific community, Aleph was firmly established as a place to work at. Scientific articles and monographs flowed from the station, and scientists returned with finished dissertations, like gold miners of the old days from rich mines. The station's population had already exceeded 150 people, and grants from various foundations and governments were flowing. Even with this trip, Vaslov and Ian, in addition to food and equipment, brought 10 scientists to the station, including the famous mathematician Kojo Okinkwa, a 3-time winner of the Abel Prize. Ian sighed. "You're just tired. You need some rest. Stretch your legs, change of scenery. We'll be moored at Aleph for a week. Why don't you take a walk around the station for a change? I do it every time, and as you can see, it does me only well." Vaslov opened his mouth to pour out his usual stream of excuses and gloomy predictions, but suddenly, a thought flashed across his face, and he squinted and nodded instead of answering. Ian wasn't sure that was exactly what he wanted. His partner was obviously up to something, but asking what was on his mind was useless. The old pilot wouldn't say a word. All right, at least Vaslov would finally crawl out of the familiar shell of the ship. What can possibly go wrong with that? In a few years and dozens of cargo trips of Hawking and other ships, the scientific station on Aleph had, in a sense, even lost a bit of the romantic spirit of the scientific frontier and was becoming more and more like a standard research facility on Earth or somewhere within the solar system. The precursor metal from which Aleph was built, seemingly ordinary steel, but with changes at the subatomic level not quite understandable to Earth science, from which a simple alloy of iron with carbon became an indestructible substance, capable of withstanding billions of years, was hidden under standard plastic cladding panels. Lighting, air conditioning systems, everything was getting close to the comfortable conditions to which scientists at home were accustomed. The station even acquired its own hydroponic farms. However, it wasn't enough to provide at least 1/3 of the staff with food. Someone had to work on the farms, and there were practically no auxiliary personnel at the station. All the blue-collar work was done by the scientists themselves. It was understandable that they wanted to reduce the amount of this work, which distracted them from the primary purpose of their stay at the station, to a minimum. Ian always liked to observe how newcomers to the station behaved. He figured long ago that scientists are mostly a different breed of people. Some were your typical crazed genius types, a kind of professor with a disheveled head, out of sync with the world around him. Some, on the contrary, were not too different emotionally from the computer, fully immersed in solving the next scientific problem. But almost all of them, when they first came to Aleph, behaved like children on their first visit to the chocolate factory, shining eyes, excitement, and eagerness to explore everything immediately. Dr. Okinkwa, however, surprised even Ian. Kojo worked in his cabin until the very last moment, right until the announcement that the ship had docked at the key arm and the passengers could proceed to the station, where they would be met. The mathematician used a combined approach. He worked with a special processor, to which he was connected through a neural interface, but he was also using the traditional, centuries-honored method of pencil and paper. When Ian knocked on his cabin to inform him that everyone had already gone to Aleph and the doctor was the last passenger on board the Hawking, Okinkwa thanked him for the reminder, disconnected from the processor, carefully gathered all the papers and a few belongings into a small bag, put the processor into a carrying case, and left the cabin without further ado. Ian assumed he would have to show the mathematician the way to the airlock, for Okinkwa had traveled that route only once before, when he had loaded on the ship. Unlike the other passengers who had taken the opportunity to study the interior of the long-range cargo spacer, mathematician had left the cabin only to visit the mess hall. However, Okinkwa walked through the labyrinth of corridors and passages between decks to the airlock, never making a mistake or even hesitating at the cross-sections. Ian only shook his head. After walking through the long transition arm between the airlocks of the ship and the station, they finally found themselves on Aleph. Ian noticed that, compared to the last visit, the strange alien odor on the station had become even less noticeable. The almost eternal, and still undetected precursor automation had maintained a breathable atmosphere on Aleph so far, but the strong odor had been a big problem at first. Eventually, they had to wall off the part of Aleph where the station was located with membranes and install powerful filters. Some odor still permeated as the station wasn't totally sealed, but breathing became noticeably easier. Okinkwa exchanged brief greetings with the greeting lady. It was Dr. Wanda Acevedo from the physics and mathematics section. Then he nodded to Ian, and two scientists left, immediately plunging into some highly specialized conversation, of which even Ian, though being the navigator and pilot of the spacer, understood at best 10% of the words. Ian stood for another minute, looking around the familiar interior of the spacious entry bay of the station, and then went to the station duty officer's post to deal with cargo documents and other formalities. Aleph was an artificial planetoid 20 clicks in diameter, built by the precursors at least 1.5 billion years ago, plus or minus 100 million. A dense, impenetrable core and 3 levels of corridors, compartments, or halls. Scientists still haven't agreed on which term is more accurate, and vertical passages between the levels. Whether it was due to the massiveness of the core or the hypothetical gravity generators installed in it, the gravity on Aleph was roughly the same as on Earth. When, a few years after the Aleph's discovery, researchers finally found a way to get inside, through one of the hull plates, which had succumbed to Earth's cutting torches, they discovered that there was a breathable, albeit pungent-smelling, atmosphere inside. And nothing else. Kilometers and kilometers of corridors, thousands of rooms, completely empty. In some of them, there were strange devices, which the scientists defined for vague reasons as devices for reading and issuing information. The whole of Aleph, accordingly, was dubbed the Library of the Precursors. Then, a research station was organized with the intent to force the library to share its data. Ian wandered around the station, looking in all the sections where his acquaintances worked. In the years he had worked on the Hawking, which served Aleph, Ian had gotten to know half of the station's personnel. He had become especially good friends with Katsuo Tago, the chemist who had come to the station to investigate the materials from which it was made. Katsuo had yet to make much progress, but the chemistry section had long been engaged in research unrelated to Aleph himself, which had brought many titles and patents to the scientists and profits to the grantors. In fact, not many people are studying Aleph anymore, Katsuo said. They were sitting at a table in one of the second-level recreation rooms. The levels on Aleph were counted backward from the surface. The third level was the deepest, located on the surface of the core. The first level housed warehouses and a hydroponic farm. The second level housed living quarters, and the third was the Holy of Holies, laboratories, and conference rooms. Although 10 days before your arrival, the cartographers returned to the station. Who returned? Ian asked in surprise. I thought Aleph had been thoroughly mapped by the Peterson expedition before they decided to build the station. Katsuo nodded. Yes, they had scanned all of Aleph and made detailed schematics from the scans. Well, except for the core, of course, which remains impenetrable for us. But it turned out that there is no access to some rooms and corridors, although they looked open on the schematics. Also, the schematics don't show all the precursor devices. We've tried sending autonomous vehicles into the tunnels, but they're not returning. Cartographers found a few with 0 batteries and wiped memory. There were debates about safety for 6 months. Then they decided to send volunteers to the expedition. The first one came back with some new data. Katsuo sipped some tonic from a tall glass, took a large, brightly colored strawberry from a vase on the table, and tossed it into his mouth. The most interesting thing was that the cartographers found a closed room on the third level, just a 1 click from the station. You could say they barely made it out of the station. All as usual. There is an entrance on the scheme, but in reality, you go around it, not even suspecting there's room nearby. I'll be damned, Ian said. I've been traveling here for a long time, and this is the first time I've heard of such a thing. Though I'm not a scientist, even without all the data you're producing here, I got my hands full. Aleph is the only place where I can get some rest. Katsuo grinned. I'll tell you more. This mathematician, whom you brought, the one with bunch of Abel prizes, thought of a way to open this room. No way. Ian was surprised. He's only been on Aleph for a couple of days. I bet he's good, but not that good. He got a plan ready, answered Katsuo. While still on Earth, he had figured out where this room is and why it's necessary to open it. He'd used Peterson's schematics, claimed that this room was a topological focal point, whatever that means. I don't know much about this math stuff. It's not my specialty. Perhaps you, as a space navigator, should know what he meant. Anyway, they did something with the high-frequency pulses, and they did open the entrance to the room. Any object can be viewed from a topological point of view, Ian said. The universe, a speck of dust, an Aleph. But I didn't know it's possible to make any applied calculations from that point. Well, he's been in the room since the first minute he walked in, Katsuo said. He's got a field lab set up, and he's been working in it non-stop, which doesn't take much for a mathematician to do, just batteries for his processor and paper and pencil. Is it safe? Katsuo shrugged. We've never had anything more serious than insomnia or mild aviteminosis in the entire existence of the station. You can check with Director Salvedo. He authorized it, but I don't think he'll tell you anything new. Aleph has long been considered perfectly safe, even with the lost drones. He poured himself another tonic from the decanter. You could ask your partner. He's been out there since morning. Ian stared at his friend in surprise. Vaslav. That's him. Katsuo was obviously finding the situation funny. He showed up at the director's office with an unusually mysterious look, talked about something behind closed doors, and went straight to the place. I didn't see it myself, but the secretary of the directorate recounted it very artistically. Ian had visualized Vaslav with his characteristic sly squint, which appeared when the old pilot was up to something original. By his own conservative standards, of course. All right, Ian finally said. It was probably for the best, because I was desperate to get him off the ship. Pour me some more. What do you put in it anyway? It tastes so good, but I can't tell. Even if I told you, you wouldn't be able to repeat it. But I won't tell you, because the patent application has already been filed. And this isn't some kind of boring math. It could be worth millions, Katsuo said, reaching for the decanter again. Of course, when they met in the evening at the Hawking, Vaslav, who had returned a couple of hours earlier than Ian, was the first to go. Actually, Ian had not even had time to formulate his first question, and the old pilot had already winked and said, You know, I think I'm ready to change my opinion about this stupid station. If not all of them, then at least some of these eggheads will do some good. Did you get Okinkwa to play poker with you, and he lost you 20 creds to not upset you? Ian teased. Vaslav only waved it away. Better. I'm telling you, this guy is brilliant. Of course, it took some effort to get through to him, but when he realized what I needed, he's got the pot working. I barely managed to keep it up with writing down the results. Come on, bring it out. Ian was curious. What kind of task could a genius mathematician solve for a spacer pilot? Vaslav pointed to the terminal of the ship's primary propulsion system. The conversation took place on the bridge of Hawking. Take a look at it yourself. Okinkwa made new calculations for the reactor force field superposition. Antimatter consumption is down 40%, while output, on the other hand, is up 20-something. I never thought such a nonsense as topology could be useful, but here you are. Ian stared at his friend, dumbfounded for a moment, then rushed to the terminal. Obeying the frantically typed commands, the screen displayed numbers describing the state of the most complex node of force fields. This kept the annihilation energy in check, allowing it to escape only in one strictly controlled direction, where it was processed into something applicable for further use. Indeed, the indicators had changed exactly as Vaslav had promised. It was terrific, as antimatter was fantastically expensive. But, damn, what were you thinking? Ian exhaled, coming to his senses a little. You can't tinker around with it just like that. What if Okinkwa had miscalculated? We'd all turn into plasma, along with Aleph. Come on, Who do you take me for? Vaslov said resentfully. We recalculated everything 3 times, and then I ran the calculations through the reactor's backup processor 10 more times, and it didn't find a single error. Jesus, Ian, you know that if the processor had found anything, it would have blocked the installation. And still, you can't trust the shake and bake calculations made by one person, as genius as he may be. Vaslov, superposition is calculated for weeks on special supercomputers. The configuration we used is one of the best developed so far. To improve it so easily by more than 50%, I just can't believe it. They argued for another half an hour before they went to their quarters. Ian had no choice but to accept it as a fact. But something was still bothering him, so he started digging through the ship's databank instead of going to bed. Having found the necessary report of the shipbuilding consortium, from whose slipways Hawking once came down, he went deep into reading. Like all spacemen, Ian, of course, knew the basics of his ship, and at the academy, he had studied the detailed structure of the reactor. Still, a thorough knowledge of the complex mathematics underlying this marvel of technology was not required for a navigator. His brain creaked and boiled while he was wading through the maze of formulas and algorithms, and several times he had to take a break to recover a little. But in the end, he found what he was looking for, and he didn't like it at all. The super-economical superposition that Okinkwa had calculated and that Vaslov had installed in the Hawking reactor was impossible. Such an option had been considered during the ship's design and rejected. The problem was not that such a superposition could not keep antimatter at the focus of the reactor, nor that it did not give the calculated energy yield. That was precisely what Okinkwa had calculated. The problem was different. The force fields could not be configured to add to this superposition. It turned out to be favorable theoretically, but not achievable in practice. And yet, the calculations were practically identical. Okinkwa had applied some transformations that were unfamiliar to Ian, but the results matched up to the last decimal point. Ian looked at his watch. It was getting close to 7 in the morning local time. It was early, of course, but he would have to bother someone. It was time to talk to a genius. "40 minutes and one unpalatable breakfast later, Ian arrived at the station director's reception desk. Instead of the expected sleepy desolation, he was surprised to find himself in a disturbed hive. People were bustling about, walking quickly, almost jogging through the corridors with a worried look. Nobody paid any attention to the spaceman, although usually everyone took the opportunity to speak with the man from the big world. After some confusion, Ian overcame the secretary's resistance and entered the station director's office. David Salvato was one of the few people who had come to Aleph for purposes other than purely scientific. He had a degree in management and economics, but his job on the station was not in research, but in managing a rambling community of the world's best scientists. Most of them were ill-equipped for anything but scientific work. So Director Salvato could also safely be considered a genius, a one in the area of management. The director had the appearance of an extremely busy and tired man, so after an exchange of greetings, Ian went straight to the point without delay. "I need to talk to Dr. Okinkwa," he said. "Yesterday, he made some calculations at the request of my pilot. I want to discuss them because the results of the calculations raise questions." "Calculations?" Salvato, a stout man of 45, waved his hand. "Dr. Okinkwa has done a lot of calculations in the last 24 hours that have raised a million questions. You are now at the end of a very long line." "But it's really important," Ian started to say, but Salvato interrupted him. "I bet it is," he exclaimed sarcastically. "Everything this mad genius touches now is important. He's already solved 2 of the 4 remaining great mathematics problems and is clearly closing in on the 3rd. Not that I can understand his calculations," he said, somewhat embarrassed. "But all the mathematicians in the station and those who can somehow understand his work, such as theoretical physicists, are now groggy. But that's just the flowers," he exclaimed triumphantly. Ian thought that the director reminded him of the owner of a dog who proudly tells how his beloved pet, left locked up, shattered the whole apartment. In between, he disproved the proof of Fermat's great theorem. "How do you like this?" Ian looked at the director, puzzled. "But it's a classic textbook example. Wiles derived that proof 200 years ago. His proof has been verified 1,000,000 times. I studied it myself in my first year at the academy. It's impossible." And yet, he did it. He proved Wiles' calculations wrong, found several numerical solutions as counterexamples, and then attacked and defeated Taniyama Shimura's theorem. It was as if he was about to trash the whole of number theory. It was at this point that Ian felt the first sprouts of suspicion forming. No one could just dismiss fundamental mathematical theorems that had been proven long ago and were the basis of modern science. For centuries. Compared to this, the strange superposition calculations for the reactor seemed like a trifle. Still, it felt crucial for some reason, though Ian could not yet say exactly why. "All the more, we need to talk to him immediately," he resolutely declared to the director, and obviously, Salvato heard something new in the voice of the spaceman. The director looked carefully into his eyes, nodded, and simply said, "Okay, let's go." The road to the focal point, for the most part, passed through places not yet developed by the station's personnel. Some equipment and furniture had been delivered to the room Dr. Okinkwa had opened, but the corridors to get there remained as the precursors had created them. Relatively spacious, angular, with strange protrusions on the walls, sometimes turning in unexpected directions for no apparent reason. Their strangeness was not striking, but it was always in the background, creating the feeling that humans were only occasional and perhaps unwelcome visitors on Aleph. Ian had had this conversation with Katsuo and the other scientists more than once. Most of them said they were used to it and didn't care, but the effort to make the main areas of the station, even the warehouses, look earthly suggested otherwise. The appearance of the precursors was still a mystery, but they most definitely thought very differently from humans. As they neared their destination, they were alerted by some commotion. At the entrance to the room where the mathematician was working, several people were crowding around without going inside. Hearing footsteps behind, one of them turned toward Ian and the director. Ian did not know this scientist, but on his breast pocket, he saw the emblem of the math section. "We can't come in," the scientist said in a strange, squeezed voice, without saying hello. It was obvious that he was extremely shaken by something. "He's just sitting inside, but we can't do anything. Dr. Okinkwa has been working non-stop for almost 24 hours, and we suggested he take a break. But he just looked at us so strange, and now it's like something is blocking our way." Ian squeezed between the huddled people, with the director Salvato breathing excitedly behind him. The room, which the mathematician called the topological focal point, was typical of Aleph. It was almost circular, actually polyhedral, but with such a small side length that it wasn't noticeable to the eye. The floor, walls, and ceiling were the same gray, inexpressive material as the planetoid. The mathematician sat in the center, with his back to the entrance on a small cushion. Ian knew from the flight that Okinkwa preferred to sit not on a chair, but on such a pad. Next to his processor, scribbled sheets of paper were scattered on the floor. Okinkwa sat absolutely still, cross-legged and unresponsive to what was happening behind him. Ian automatically wanted to step inside, but to his amazement, he could not do so. The invisible barrier was not a solid wall. Instead, it was like an elastic substance whose resistance increased proportionately to the force applied, gently enveloping it and pushing it back out. "It won't let you in," said the mathematician who met them. "We have already tried everything. It's been about 10 minutes since it happened, and Dr. Okinkwa does not react to anything. We tried to call him. He did not even move." Salvedo looked inward worriedly. He had always been a man of practical mind. "We've got to get him out," he said. "I don't know if there's any air in there. He could suffocate." The mathematician spread his hands in confusion. "How? We tried to reach with a pole and even threw a cord with a weight. It repels everything. And the combination of impulses which opened the room, there may be a second entrance." The mathematician shook his head. "That was the first thing we tried, to no avail." Ian, meanwhile, was thinking feverishly. A superposition that can't exist. A refutation of a long-ago proven fundamental theorem. The increased creative productivity of all the scientists on the station and the weird things happening in this room. Ordinary creative people on Aleph become almost geniuses. And what would a genius become? "We need to get everybody from the physics lab in here right away," said Salvedo. "They've got all kinds of equipment. Maybe we can use it somehow. Cut through the walls, get Okinkwa out with some kind of force field." "No!" Ian was surprised by his own yell. "Don't do this!" Several astonished gazes turned to him. "What do you mean?" Director Salvedo finally asked. "Dr. Okinkwa has clearly fallen into some kind of precursor trap and must be rescued." Ian felt suddenly confident, although his confidence was mixed with fear. He finally put the pieces of the puzzle together. "We can't touch him," he said. "If we do, we'll probably become the ones who need a rescue. Right now, this is the most untouchable human being, or rather the most untouchable being in the entire galaxy, maybe the universe." Salvedo opened his mouth to object, a look of utter amazement and indignation on his face, but he froze with a sagging jaw because a bright light suddenly burst from the room. Everyone turned around. The glow seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Bright, but not so bright as to be blinding. It wasn't like the metal of the precursors was glowing. It was more like the air itself, or some particles invisible to the eye. The light was evenly distributed throughout the room, making it seem much larger, almost without visible boundaries. But that wasn't what was most striking. Dr. Okinkwa, still in the same seated posture, hovered in the center of the room, surrounded by a halo of a slightly brighter glow. I think Peterson sensed something when he named the artifact Aleph. The first letter of the ancient alphabet is the beginning of everything. The topological focal point, as the former Dr. Okinkwa put it. What do you mean, former? Ian looked thoughtfully past Director Salvedo at the emptied conference room. The evacuation of personnel was almost complete. They had to urgently convert some of Hawking's cargo bays into living quarters for this. Only a few people were to remain on the station, to keep a cautious watch and in no way attempt to force contact. I don't know the proper term for what or who Dr. Okinkwa became. Perhaps the closest definition would be God, though I realize that science cannot operate with such categories. But look, What else would you call a being who can change the laws of nature with his mind? Salvato shook his head. I can't believe it. I'm sorry. I just can't believe it. I can't either. Ian grinned. But you have to. This place turned out to be a true focal point, the very fulcrum on which the whole world could be turned upside down. That's why the precursors built Aleph here. Maybe they studied it, maybe they used it, or just wanted to prevent anyone from accidentally stumbling upon it. I think it had some kind of effect on the people in its vicinity, hence the flood of discoveries from the station. And who knows which laws of nature were discovered here and which were created. It's a chilling concept. Salvato shuddered. What if Okinkwa gets the idea to mess around with fundamental constants, for example? I suppose you and I will never know if it happens because of the instant disappearance, Ian said. But I don't think it will come to that. Dr. Okinkwa was a model of prudence and calmness when he was human. I envy your confidence. Do you realize that the whole edifice of science now hangs by a thread over the precipice? Okinkwa has already dealt a terrible blow to mathematics. Now all textbooks must be rechecked. Who knows how this will change the universe? Ian shook his head. You won't believe this, but I wish I could share your concerns. Mine's are way more scary. Salvato stared at him blankly. Think about it, Director. The focal point that made Dr. Okinkwa our local god is far from the center of Aleph. As far as I know, the core of Aleph remains a complete mystery since no means of penetrating it has yet been found. So I'm thinking, what if the God Room is only needed to explore what the core hides? And if this room makes man an omnipotent god, what is the core capable of? Shocked, Salvato could not find anything to answer. The shock had broken his integrity, and the director had to urgently incorporate a few topological functions into the non-linear series of his outer shell, hastily absorbing them from the remains of the concert hall's furnishings. Ian noticed that the array of complex variables, always Salvato's most striking feature, had shifted somewhat on the coordinate grid, and in general, the entire complex function that made up the director's personality needed to be recalculated in many ways. That was okay, he decided. Everyone would have plenty of time to recover their math essence while returning back to their native geometry plane.